Today we're joined by Amy and Leon Cass, and we're going to be talking about two speeches on the subject of courage. This is based on one fictional speech and one real speech. The fictional speech by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain shortly before the Battle of Gettysburg, the other by George Patton shortly before the invasion of Normandy in 1944. And just by way of setting up the conversation, let me just say a few things about Chamberlain and the book we'll be discussing. The speech that's in the anthology here is from Michael Shaara's justly famous novel Killer Angels, which is about the Battle of Gettysburg. It is a book which is very accurate, if somewhat selective, in the events that it discusses. But as Shaara himself says, it's largely a book that's about the interpretation of character. And I think for most of the people who read Killer Angels, the most interesting character of all is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. His career in the Civil War is quite remarkable. He was a professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College up in Maine. He joins the Army, I think, roughly the age of 31 or 32. He's served at this point for a year and a half, 2 years. After the Battle of Gettysburg, he will continue to serve. He'll be wounded multiple times. He will receive, I believe, the only field promotion to the rank of brigadier general. He is subsequently made a major general, and he's selected by Ulysses S. Grant to receive Lee's surrender at Appomattox. So he is a genuinely heroic figure in history, and not simply in Michael Shaara's rendition of him. And one of the most powerful parts of the book is this speech, which you've excerpted. So maybe, Amy, could I turn to you and ask you to kind of set the scene for us, and then we'll begin to pull it apart.
The Army is on the move, and Chamberlain, who's the colonel of the 20th Maine, has suddenly received 120 mutineers, war-weary mutineers from the 2nd Maine. And the orders are that he can shoot them if they don't do their duty. So he faces a real dilemma. First of all, he can dearly use these men to join his regiment, because his own regiment has been depleted from 1,000 down to less than 250 already. Second, he knows that he doesn't have the manpower to guard them, or to properly guard them or take care of them. And third, because they, like him, are from Maine, he knows that he would never be able to shoot them. And Shaara's Chamberlain, being more the philosopher than the commander, also faces the dilemma: how can you really force people to fight for freedom?
You said that in Shaara's rendition, Chamberlain is more the philosopher than the commander. Could you just, either or both of you, expand a little bit on that? What kind of person is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain?
Well, there's a description of him that makes him sort of kind of boyish looking. What's the exact words? Grave, a man of boyish dignity, clean-eyed, scrub brain, naive look of the happy professor. But he's also tall, he's rather picturesque. He is thoughtful, but he's presented really as a man of action. There is complicated things going on in his brain, but he's not, like many professors, indecisive. He knows what he has to do, and he has a gift for speaking. And when he speaks, everybody stops to listen. There's something in his voice that makes people pay attention. This is not just professorial talk. This is a man with authority.
Right. Well, but Shaara goes out of his way to tell us that Chamberlain was a professor of rhetoric.
Right.
And just a year before that he gives this speech.
In a way, Chamberlain is the professor we professors would all like to be, right? Both the philosopher and the man of action. So there are these mutineers. The mutineers actually approach, and they've got a set of grievances. Could you talk a little bit about what those grievances are? What the first thing he does actually is he hears them out first, which is actually he does two things. He hears them out and he feeds them a good meal, which shows you that even before there's speech on his part. He's undertaken some practical action, which is quite sound in the circumstances.
Well, actually, even before he feeds them, he liberates them. They come in and they're described like impressed seamen. And they're watched over by a foul-mouthed, bellicose captain who has contempt for Maine men. And they're guarded by surly guards. And the first thing he does is he dismisses the captain, he dismisses the guards, and basically makes them, in the first instance, like free men, as a preparation for the free choice he's eventually going to give them.
Okay, and then he does give them a square meal, but he talks to
And then he goes.
their leader, a man named Buckland.
Right.
And what's going on with Buckland?
Well, first of all, he knows that the reason that they are mutineers is because the Second Maine has been disbanded. And they had signed up for 3 years, and the rest of them had signed up for 2 years. Those who were left had signed up for 2 years. So that's why they've been impressed into the service for 1 more year.
Right, but their understanding of their own obligations is they had signed up for the Second Maine.
Exactly. And they will only fight with the Second Maine.
Right, and that actually, it touches on a certain aspect of the American military tradition, which is it's a very contractual understanding of obligations, which is you fulfill the obligations, but they are well defined, and if the government violates them, then the agreement's over. Okay, so there's that legal piece to it.
So there's
what else,
that.
But
but
else is going on?
Buckland, who's speaking on behalf of the 120, actually speaks in the first person. He says, first of all, I'm tired. I've been wounded. I've been in 11 engagements. We've seen it all. They're really sickened by the way they've been treated. They've been treated like cows or dogs or worse, like the slaves that Leon was describing, which is why they were in need of some kind of liberation. But he emphasizes that he doesn't think that they're going to win in any case. The Union is not going to win because of those officers, the officers who come from West Point. And he has a particular animus against the officers from West Point.
Why do you think that's the case?
You think it's a class thing?
Yeah, well, as I, of course, I read carefully the excerpts that you have in the book. He talks about these goddamn gentlemen.
Yeah.
So I think it is a class thing.
Well, I think you're right that Buckland, at least, has this animus against the gentlemen and the officers. It's not clear that that's simply shared through the ranks. It says that he's been waiting a long time to say this to some officer.
Right.
And Chamberlain lets him do it and says, I get your point. But they've been losing. And they've been changing generals right and left. I mean, the war has been going terribly. And these men have been in there for 2 years. They've been there and seen everything. And they blame the defeats on their leadership, which could be aggravated by certain class enmity, but could be in a way justified. These idiot guys who go there and study, and we're down on the ground getting slaughtered. Show us that we're going to get some leadership, we might think differently about it.
I'm interested in how Chamberlain approaches, okay, he's heard Buckland. He's now going to talk to these guys after they've had a good meal in sound psychology, I think. There's a very interesting passage that I'd like to ask the two of you to comment on, where Chamberlain is trying to decide what to say to these people. And he says he had a complicated brain, he meaning Chamberlain, and there were things going on back there from time to time that he only dimly understood. So he relied on his instincts, but he was learning all the time. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, that you have this professor, this man of thought, this philosopher, who's relying on his instincts and on the sense that there's stuff humming around in the back of his head that he knows he doesn't fully understand, and that is somehow going to guide him in what he is about to say. Does that strike you at all?
What does it mean to rely on one's instincts? Well, he's under a great deal of pressure. The courier has just come to tell them that the army has to get up and move again. he's reading their faces. He's hoping that there could be some connection because they're made men. These are not very philosophical or theoretical things, but instinctually he knows he cannot shoot them. He just knows that, and he's going to make that clear to them at the very beginning of the speech.
Shaara gives us what he imagines is going on in Chamberlain's mind. And what Chamberlain, although the situation is complicated, Chamberlain himself, his faith, he says, is rather simple. He believes in the dignity of man. He loves America because it's the land of the individual, where there's no royalty, there are no aristocracy, that a man can become all that he can be, that we are fighting for freedom, not for land, for people and not for territory. That's what he would like to say, but he can't say that. He says those are tired words.
What is the pitch that he does make?
The pitch is really, I think,
Brilliant.
brilliant. Men, I've heard your grievances. There's nothing I can do about them today. When I get a chance, I'll look into them and see that you get a fair hearing. Second, I've been told that if you don't fight, I can shoot you, but I'm not going to do that. And third, whether you fight or not, that's up to you. We've got orders to move, and whether you come or not, well, you're coming. So the opening speech, he takes their grievances seriously, shows them some respect, indicates that he has no intention of shooting them, and says, look, whether you want to fight, that's up to you. Basically, he solved the problem about whether you can force men to fight for freedom by making them free men and saying the choice is yours.
The choice about fighting is,
Yeah.
he says, you're coming with me.
You're coming with
You're
me.
coming
with
with
me.
me, but
He's
whether
not
you-
saying you can go home.
No, you're coming with me, but whether you fight or not is up to you.
So he is empowering them by giving them choice. But then he makes the case for freedom. He makes an ideological
Yes.
argument. Now, he also says, all of us enlisted for different reasons. And of course, this is an army of volunteers, not an army of draftees. We'll get back to that. He said some of us because we're bored, some of us thought it might be fun, some of us were ashamed. And then he launches into a defense of freedom. No man has to bow. It is, at least in my reading, but I'd be curious to know what you think. It is, again, this anti-aristocratic argument, that this is a place where no man born to royalty. Here we judge you by what you do, not by what your father was. Although I have to ask you, given that you're great admirers of the book, as am I mean, isn't Chamberlain himself a wholly superior kind of being?
By nature,
A natural
a
aristocrat.
natural aristocrat. He
But-
has the look of authority.
But is there anything problematic with having natural aristocrats roaming around?
Well, it depends upon how they comport themselves and how they speak to people like these 120 mutineers. And part of the speech is not articulated. It's the tone he uses. He speaks quietly. He's obviously, or must have been, a wonderful teacher of rhetoric, because his rhetoric and everything that surrounds it is really perfect, it seems to me. He speaks quietly, softly, so they have to gather round and listen.
Do you think he's self-conscious about that?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
So he's not just operating on instinct.
Well, not just instinct.
But no, he dissembles his superiority. One of the tasks of all really great leaders, in a way, is to try to, if the gap between the leader and the led is too great, it produces envy and resentment and the like. If it's too narrow, there's no regard and no respect. He manages that absolutely
Right.
beautifully.
In many ways, I think the book is a wonderful study, not just in courage, in a lot of things, but including in leadership. In that last passage, one of the things that's quite interesting is he starts by talking about freedom. The way he ends, it says, what we're all fighting for in the end is each other.
What do you think that means?
Well, I think in that respect, I think Shaara, who had himself been a soldier, understood that a lot of what motivates people to fight is not ideology; it ends up being their comrades.
Yeah.
And but what Chamberlain does, I think, in this passage or Shaara making Chamberlain talk, is he combines both. There is this kind of a broader case about freedom and about the nature of the United States, and he brings that to we're all fighting for each other, which is really something that I think is the case quite frequently independent of the cause that you're fighting for.
I think that's right, but earlier in his reflections on America and why it's different to fight for America, he appeals to the universal principle that all men are equal, and he's fighting to free human beings, which means, he says, he concludes there, he's fighting for himself.
He's doing both, and he understands, I think, the power of both.
But fighting for each other would then mean that we're fighting for all men. We're fighting for all
I don't know.
humankind.
I mean, he's also, this is a guy who's very conscious of being, he's a Maine man. He's very conscious of the tribal tie.
But he's also very conscious of the universal American principle.
And when he bends down to pick up the dirt, he says, this is free dirt all the way to the Pacific. In other words, you begin by taking the Maine men and the Maine tie seriously. And these are men who wouldn't fight except for Maine men. In fact, not even with Maine men altogether, but only with, with the second Maine. That's who they signed up for. He's in a way showing them that they belong to a cause which is a national cause, and not merely a national cause, but a universal cause in the way in which Amy has said. And the final remark that we're fighting for each other is not, it seems to me, what is commonly said today, that people in the Army, when you really want to know why they fight, they're fighting for the guy in the foxhole next to them. It's not, we're fighting for ourselves as fellow soldiers. We're fighting for each other because of an idea, the idea that all of us have value. I think there is a sense that we brothers here, but it's not we brothers in battle only. The decisive sense of the brotherhood here is the brotherhood of man, understood as equally worthy.
I think,
and in that sense, by the way, he is giving them the principle that he gives them the principle that's in a way been violated in their eyes by how they've been treated by their previous officers and how they were treated when you first saw them marched in like impressed seamen. After the high-pitched speech about ideals and principles, he then descends, and that's also important. He says, look, it's still the Army, but you're as free as I can make you. Have a conversation, decide for yourself. You got two choices. You can either get your rifles and come and fight, or you'll come under guard. In the end, I'll do what I can. And then finally, this wonderful pitch,
It's wonderful.
If we lose this fight, we're going to lose the war. So if you'll join us, I'd personally be very grateful. And in the end, he's trafficking in the kind of trust that he has earned by freeing them, feeding them, taking their grievances seriously, respecting them, speaking to them as fellow Americans, and speaking to the better angels of their nature.
let's move to talk about the Patton speech. Now, the narrative is described as being given on June 5th, 1944, which would be the day before D-Day. Again, just sort of in the interest of the historical record, it was a speech that was given multiple times by Patton because he gave it to all the different members of the Third Army. And of course, they were scattered all over the place. I have to confess, I have a personal connection with all this. My uncle was a doctor who was in one of the mobile hospitals of Third Army. And I remember when the movie Patton came out, in which George C. Scott gives a cleaned-up version of this speech, I asked him, I said, did you ever hear the speech? And my uncle, who was at that point a very distinguished professor of medicine at the University of Chicago, said, yes. I said, well, what was your reaction to it? And he said, well, I listened to the speech and I was very disappointed. It was profane, it was vulgar, it was simplistic, and I thought to myself, this is the kind of man who's going to lead this enterprise. And then he said, and then as I was walking out, I listened to all the soldiers, and they were all tremendously excited. Then my uncle lowered his glasses in a way that he had and said, and that, young man, was when I realized I still had a few things left to learn. That has always stuck with me. This is a very different kind of speech. It is a profane, vulgar speech, lots of scatological references, the number of sexual references. Let's again just sort of get to the setting. What can we infer from the speech are Patton's concerns about his troops? We know what Chamberlain's concerns about the main men are. What do you think are Patton's concerns about the troops that he's trying to motivate with this speech?
Well, first of all, there are two very different wars. It's a difference between a civil war and this war. This had an enemy that was a foreign enemy. But he has at least this is the way I envision it. I think they are young, untried men who are standing before him. They've never been in real battle. And he's speaking, number one, to their fear of death. Number two, to their fear of killing. Killing and in addition to being killed. And their fear of being cowards under this. And the entire rhetoric of the speech seems to move back and forth to show them that what it means. He says, first of all, why are you fighting? And he's trying to boost their morale. Why are you fighting? You're fighting for your homeland, for your families. That's duty. You're fighting for your self-respect. That's honor. But you're also fighting because you're men, real men. So he's trying to make these young people who have never really been tested in war, just, in getting ready to go to battle, and make them feel like Chamberlain was doing. He's appealing to the better angels of their nature, but in a very, very different way.
You think he's appealing to the better angels of their nature?
Well, he's trying to make them feel confident.
I guess my reading of it is
Well,
he's largely appealing to testosterone, which is not, I've never really thought of as a better angel.
If the courage is a virtue, then he's appealing to that virtue.
Leon?
Well, I'm more inclined to join Amy in the formulation. I agree with her diagnosis of what the problem is. These are boys. I mean, they're
How old are they, 18?
between, I would say the majority of them are probably between 18 and 20, wouldn't you say?
No, actually, well, they'd be older than that too, because the draft scooped up a lot of people, so some of them would be in their 20s. But
in their 20s,
Yeah.
but certainly rookies. I mean,
right, they are definitely that.
they've never been in battle. And the major rhetorical problem is to address and try to help them curb their fears, and also to inspire them to fight, and to fight zealously.
Is it all about fighting?
Well, he also wants to make sure, that's part of curbing their fears. He wants to make sure that they realize
I think what he
they're
wants-
part of a team.
Yeah, well, he wants to make them part of a team. He wants them all to do their duty. See, I don't think this is simply about courage in the narrow sense. He wants everybody to understand you've got an important role to play, even if you're, I mean, what is the one heroic example that he talks about? It's a guy who's shimmying up a
Telephone
pole
to fix a wire.
To fix a wire. It's not somebody who's actually going out and killing a German. It's a guy who's doing his duty despite fear and doing it well. And similarly, he talks about the drivers, and of course, a lot of the folks driving the trucks would have been African American soldiers who, drove for 40 hours.
The guy who's going up the pole is being shot from.
But I think part of
Planes overhead.
What is it that he denounces in all this? He denounces a view of courage. He denounces the idea of individual heroism.
Oh, yeah.
Remember? And he says that the people who think that all this is about individual heroics know less about war than they know about sexual activity.
If we're right about what the rhetorical problem is and what he's trying to accomplish, the very first thing he does is he opens by appealing to American manliness and America's love of victory, and their own love of their own families and homes, their love of their own honor, and their own manhood, and tells them America despises cowards. Right? After that kind of introduction, then he addresses directly their fear of death, and it's wonderful. First line is, all of you are not going to die. Actually, only about 2% of you are going to die. Everyone's scared. Anybody who says he's not scared is lying. But a real man won't let his fear of death overpower his honor, his sense of duty to his country, or his innate manhood. Then he goes on to say, look, battle is the most magnificent competition. That's where the best comes out. That's where one overcomes all that's base. Americans pride themselves on being he-men, and they really are he-men.
Well,
And
actually,
by the way, the enemy's just as frightened as you are.
that line, battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge. It brings out all that is best and removes all that is base. Page 3. Do you believe that?
Do I believe that's simply true? It would take some discussion, and I probably would wind up saying no. But there is a sense in which battle is where a person has a chance to put their entire life on their line with their own valor and their own prowess, and serve something greater than themselves and serve the people next to them.
It's also not an accident that ancient epics were all about battle.
Right.
There is something about rolling your entire life up into one moment and asking yourself, how will you stand with respect to your own finitude? And will you distinguish yourself as conquering your fears and doing your duty, or will you fail?
Can you imagine Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain ever saying that?
No.
Why not?
Partly the philosopher in him. Partly it's a different situation. Partly look, we don't know whether Patton really believed that either. What we do know,
Actually, we do. He did.
well, we do know also that he wasn't really a profane speaker. He didn't speak like that normally. He used to practice in front of the
Right.
mirror.
Yeah.
He was a
Right.
real thinker. And so might even be exaggerating for the point, but I think Leon's point is really very well taken. What does it mean to beat down mortality?
Well, but isn't this basically, it's an appeal to manhood, right?
Yeah.
In fact, the speech begins, men.
Right.
This stuff that some sources sling around about America wanting out of this war, not wanting to fight, is a crock of bullshit. Americans love to fight, traditionally. All Americans love the sting and clash of battle.
That Americans like victory rather than losers up until a certain
That's true.
point? True. You see it transferred into athletics, and notwithstanding the belief that every kid should come home from camp a winner with his own trophy, we basically prefer the people who actually go out there and fight and win. Patton couldn't get away with making such a speech today, but I would imagine that there are lots of young men, for better and for worse, who would respond exactly as the people who he spoke to then responded to this speech, because there really is something about the appeal to courage and the appeal to use your courage in the service of something
Well,
that is honorable.
I think that's right. It's what inspires a lot of, particularly young males, to volunteer. On the other hand, you could not give a speech like this to just about any military unit.
To a co-ed unit.
Right, which most units are. And
Humankind doesn't do it.
there are different ways that one can attempt to elicit courage. And one is the Chamberlain way. It's making a pitch for the cause. One of it is trying to inspire people with their sense of the charisma of the leader. And both Chamberlain does that one way, and Patton is doing it another way. I mean, Patton is going up there with his shiny helmet and his revolver, and he makes a big point of telling, as he tells the story about the guy who shimmies up the telephone pole, that he says, "I'm much more scared of you than I am of the Germans shooting."
Right.
Well, that's I think very much done with malice aforethought. He's trying to impress his personality. So that's another way of doing it. I think a third way of doing it is this appeal to manhood as understood by a 20-year-old.
But look, Chamberlain wasn't facing cowards or even potential cowards. These were guys who were in 11 battles. They were wounded. They were just war weary. They felt they'd been cheated. These were as his sergeant says, I saw these guys. These are loggers. They love to fight.
They're tough.
They're tough men. Patton's concern is that these young, and again, citizen soldiers for the most part, not a professional army, people who in private life are basically peace-loving, prosperity-loving people who've signed up signed up for whatever reason. The major concern he has is that they are not going to be up to the task. And therefore, the major vice that he wants to force them to loathe is yellow cowardice. Right. So what other appeal would you make to them?
And look, the other wonderful thing that he does in this speech is the gift that he leaves them with at the end, is what you can tell your grandchildren. When your grandchildren, when you're old and your grandchild is sitting on your knee and asks you, what were you doing during the war, the big war?
Part of it is about the Great Third Army, and part of it is about George S. Patton.
No, George E. Patton. He doesn't even refer to himself with a proper title.
Yeah, look, this is another instance of what we talked about with the Chamberlain. Patton is trying once again to dissemble, in part dissemble his superiority, and make a team in which they are members of his team and he is one of them. And it's not just that they're going to remember that they fought with George E. Patton, but they're going to swear like George E. Patton when they're talking to their grandchild.
And that I'm not so sure.
Well, but that's what he has them say. What he wants them to say is to refer to him in the same way as he refers to everybody else. Look, the profanity is a way of cutting the tension, reducing the fear, and making them feel a team with him. They laugh uproariously, they slap their thighs in all of those places, and he makes them a team even before he starts speaking of the Army as a team.
He makes them a team by making them laugh together.
Yeah.
They laugh at him, they laugh at what he's saying, they laugh with him.
And by the way, for cowards, for potential cowards, the last thought he leaves them with is not that some of you are going to die here, but think ahead to when it's all over. Think of yourself as in a kind of a mode where you can tell the next generation of your heroic deeds. That's the last, in a way, thing you want to say to people who are frightened.
So let's step back a little bit from both of these speeches. Each of these are dealing with different circumstances, right? George S. Patton is dealing with this army of draftees. He's got a professional soldier's doubt about civilians. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, it's the Civil War, all those things are because, I take your points that these are very much shaped by the particular milieu in which they occur, the particular set of circumstances, the particular war. What are the larger things we take home from this? George S. Patton would be an anachronism, in many ways. The Army doesn't want Pattons today. What would you do if Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, associate professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College, showed up today? Would you take him? No, of course not. What are you talking about? You got to start with ROTC or West Point and work your way up. So these are two obsolete leaders, motivating men, not men and women, who of a kind that we're not likely to see again. So
courage is still desideratum. And it's still a very important human virtue. It may not be the most important one, but there are circumstances where it is uppermost. Courage you don't generally produce by speeches. Courage is generally acquired by practice in fearful situations and learning to beat down your fears, or learning how to live and do the right things in the face of your fears, which may never simply go away. And it's always a question of how do leaders both inspire men to beat down their fears, to do what's necessary, to function together as a collective, and to serve the higher purposes for which they have been brought together, so that even though the circumstances have changed, it seems to me there are lessons here about leadership. There are lessons here about about what needs to be addressed and the kinds of things that one can appeal to. And if you can't appeal to the sorts of things like honor and solidarity and manhood and duty, then it's not clear what kind of a pitch somebody can make. It might very well be that we don't want patents today, but then the question is, are we doing a good enough job in the absence? Or what kind of rhetoric of speech takes its place? That would be one point. The second is that this is not just for the fighting people, but also for the country that sends its professional soldiers to war. It needs to somehow understand what it is they're about and what they're doing and what motivates them. And this is a very hard thing in democratic times where people are encouraged to privately pursue their own happiness. They're led to believe, as Benjamin Franklin's list of virtues that we discuss in the book list, that self-command is, and the cultivation of your own virtue is perfect for pursuing both your self-interest and the good of others. Well, you can't say that about courage. Can't really, courage is not one of those places where you serve others and at the same time serve your own self-interest and fulfill yourself. And this is self-sacrifice we're talking about. And that doesn't sit easily in a democratic polity. So it seems to me that how you lead the soldiers and how you cultivate courage is one thing, and how you educate a soft, basically pacifist kind of polity to have regard for this kind of activity and the need for it, that I think is an enduring problem.
Do you think we have basically a soft pacifist polity?
Vastly more than at the end of the Second War.
By design, we have that kind of polity. We have a polity that is dedicated to safety and comfort, acquisition.
I have to tell you, I disagree with you both. I mean, I think we've got actually a pretty violent polity, which has no trouble using force
Well, I think.
and finding people to use it.
So you think that Patton is right? We really like a winner, and we're very, very competitive.
I have a perfectly substantial chunk of the population which is quite prepared to go out and kill people.
I want to amend what I said. It's certainly true that there's a segment of the population of which that is true. And the other task in a democratic polity is, I mean, you've got to encourage some to think that noble sacrifice is not terrible and not blowing it all. Mm-hmm. You've also got to restrain the militaristic spirit and bring it under civilian rule and other kind of moderating limits.
Could I speak to that last point? I was very struck when I look at the book, the section on courage, I think has 6 sections, and of which 5 are really about martial courage. And I guess my question is, isn't there as much need for civic courage, including frequently individual courage? As I was reading through it, I was reflecting on a television series which had a huge impact on me growing up, Profiles in Courage, which was a television version of John F. Kennedy's award-winning book. And I was very struck that they were cases of, which I think we would all agree, were people showing enormous courage, which usually meant standing alone against their own crowd. John Adams being willing to defend the soldiers accused of the Boston Massacre. There's a senator from Alabama in the 1920s who took on the Ku Klux Klan and lost his seat as a result, and many others. Isn't that kind of courage as necessary for the preservation of a free republic as martial courage? And in general, if you could just reflect on the relationship between civil courage and martial courage.
Definitely, yes, that courage is necessary in civilian life. Part of the reason we have martial courage here is, I think, as Leon was suggesting, that you're putting your life on the line. So what's at stake is something different from what's at stake when we went to Mississippi, for example, in summer of 1965 and worked with the civil rights movement. It took a great act of courage on my part to drive down there with northern license plates and I had an accident the first 5 minutes on the road, and I thought that was it. I was finished. And turns out that wasn't the case, but yes, courage is necessary. Courage is necessary to speak out against unpopular opinions. But it's a different kind of courage that we're talking about.
What are the virtues that citizens are in a way called upon to display? The first thing, strange to say, is they're first called upon, it seemed to us, to practice some kind of self-command and to earn some self-respect. To have their own house in order. Second, they're obliged to be law-abiding and also have some care for the doing of justice. But then there's a question, what happens when the polity as a whole is threatened? And therefore the question is, don't we need people who are willing to make the sacrifice and to display courage against the fear of that particularly great evil, the fear of death, when the polity itself and its own existence and safety is on the line? That doesn't mean that that's the only place where the character of the polity is on the line. I mean, if the polity is riven by injustice, it requires people who would have the courage to stand up and speak out against it, as the examples that you cite indicate. Courage, generically speaking, you'd say courage is the excellent disposition with respect to the fearful things, and death might be
The greatest.
might be the greatest thing. I mean, other people would say dishonor is worse than death. One could fear loss of wealth. One could feel loss of a job. One could feel loss of status. One could feel loss of one's good name and reputation. And there are all kinds of occasions where people are called to face those losses and the fear of those losses and to act bravely, and we're better off for that.
It's not really a virtue simply, is it? You can be courageous in a very bad cause.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then it's
Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is going off to fight against men who are very courageous in a very bad cause.
And you have Lee.
Right.
But
Tremendously
that's
courageous in
what
a
he's talking
very
about.
bad cause.
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I mean, that's.
but it's still courage,
Right.
because courage is the disposition of your soul with respect to the fearful things, with
Yeah,
respect
yeah.
to fear, and in the extreme, the fear of death.
Yeah. It was said, you don't hear it said anymore. Don't hear it said much since 9/11. But it used to be said in universities 20, 25 years ago that we're looking forward to a world in which courage will be unnecessary. It's a virtue whose time is passé. And that's a mistake. And a decent regime can never have contempt for the courage.
I think it's Churchill who said, courage is the virtue that makes all other virtues possible. And I think that, in my own view, that's true, actually.
But you mean it by a much bigger sense of courage, right?
Yeah, I do think so. I give you a lot more credit, actually, than you know, for the civil rights thing, because, as Chamberlain says, people find themselves in the army for all kinds of reasons. And some noble, some not so noble, some force of circumstances. And once you're there, they've got you. And there are a lot of external constraints. Yes, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is not willing to shoot them. Other people would be willing to shoot
Right.
the mutineers of the Second Maine. You could get the guys from Indiana to shoot them quite happily.
Right.
And even he's not going to let them go. And they're going to put him in a situation where, and
Right.
in fact, this is what happens. You guys are going to sit and watch while we get gunned down, so then the Confederates come and bayonet you? Probably not. And I think there are a lot of military organizations are designed first to instill courage. They do all kinds of things to instill courage, but they also constrain your choices. Your choices about going down south in 1965 were entirely unconstrained.
True.
So I think you're very brave. And thank goodness for it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have.